We have a number of accounts of the First Crusade, which near the beginning mention the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II formally proclaimed what became the Crusade. Okay? And when people discuss the Crusade, the First Crusade especially, what happened is very important, but it's also interesting to wonder what was in the mind of the man who effectively got it all going. What did he have planned? And what they achieved, did that relate to his intention, or did the eventual crusade, as it ended up happening, go off on a different line, a different way? None of these texts really claim to give the exact words of Pope Urban, but they write as if they are. So it's kind of, if it was for us today, we'd have quotes around it, quotations around to sort of suggest that. But I don't suppose the writers or their readers at the time really assumed that this was an exact replica, okay? So it's not like today where we can video someone or record someone and then we can say we're getting the exact words. It's essentially a different mindset. But the idea is that they're giving the more or less the idea of what he was meant to have said. But if you read these texts, they're all quite different. They're all actually saying different things. The emphasis in some is quite strong in one way and not so strong in the other ways. So that's our first point. What kind of was going on? There are a number of kind of supplementary little texts which I can pull out of my magician's hat at some points as we go along. But our main focus will be these 5 texts. Now, a complicating factor is that they're all kind of connected. They're not all completely separate from one another. They're not existing in a vacuum, but like many texts in the Middle Ages, someone eventually saw a version of someone else's text and copied bits or used bits and things like that. So scholars believe that there are some interrelationships between these texts. So even though I've got dates here and I'm not clear about everything, we're going to add a few arrows. Maybe I'll use a red one for this. Now, probably the earliest text in time was a short, relatively short account, the Gesta, okay, the deeds of the Franks, which was written round about 1100 to 1101. And as it turns out, various other authors used this or even believed that they were writing an improved version of this, so they were adding to it. So Fulcher, as we might say, believes that he had, well, they all do effectively, they all were aware of the Gesta in one way or another. But in addition, apparently Guibert of Nogent also had access to one of the versions of Fulcher's book as well. So when we make any comments, we have to be aware that they're kind of aware of some, if not of all the others, and so on. So we put this one in the middle, okay. The earliest version, which I think we may have lost properly, of Fulcher was written during the following few years, okay. Guibert a little bit after that. Baldric of Dole a little bit later on. Oh, and I haven't got the date for, and I think round about 1120 for Robert the Monk, as he's sometimes called. Second problem is whether any of these guys were actually at the Council of Clermont when Pope Urban made his official proclamation or call for the Crusade. And from what I can see, looking in various books and a little bit on the internet as well, and what it says here, it's all very unclear. So I've ended up putting Some guys kind of suggest they were, the way they write, okay? Others may well have been, but it's not clear. So it's possible that some or all of these people may have been at the council, but we can't prove that, okay? For example, I think Robert the monk claims to have been there, but whether that was definite or not is not clear. And they suggest the others write as if they were there, and they're just reporting what they heard and changing it. So we've got a few problems. Firstly, the connections between the texts, and secondly, who was actually there, and are they reporting firsthand what they heard and then changing it or not, or are they reporting what someone told them that they think they heard, in which case we've got a number of steps from the original thing. So it's quite complicated in a way, but we need to take these things into account. Let's have a look at each one briefly, maybe one by one, just making a few comments about kind of what it seems to be saying. The big question I want us to really talk about is Jerusalem. Was Urban calling the crusade? Did he want the Crusaders, as they become known as, did he want these people to actually go to Jerusalem and liberate it for Christianity? Or was Jerusalem something which is a second thought? Okay. Remember, in terms of the loss of the Eastern Roman Empire to the Islamic world, we have the very early phases of Islamic expansion under the Arabs into obviously North Africa and the Near and Middle East in the early years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and that's when Jerusalem is lost from Christianity. And then in the 11th century we have the Turkish Seljuk expansion into Anatolia, which then reduces the Byzantine Empire, as we call it by that point, and we get various requests for help from the Byzantines to the west, which is the immediate context for the Crusade. So Jerusalem had not been Christian in that sense for many centuries, as Murat mentioned, I think, on Friday last week. But the recent problems suffered by the Byzantines, the successes and expansions of the... Do you have the text, Eileen, for reading? We're reading the text now. Yes. You've got a copy with you? Yes. Because yeah, okay, that's fine, because everyone's kind of sitting together trying to see. So if you've got it, you can just sit down. So then the question is, why are they concerned with Jerusalem now? Or was it that that's what they ended up getting to Jerusalem, so then we get Jerusalem kind of added in? We'll talk a bit about that as well. But let's start going through, well, the order which we're given from the website that we've been looking at, okay? Saying a little bit about what seems to be the main character of the accounts here. So with Fulke, or Fulcher as we want to say, what seems to be the important issues here? What is Fulcher stressing? Anyone got any notes, anything? Hi Maria, do you have the text of... No? Okay, well you go and sit next to Eileen then. Eileen, you've got yours, yes? Oh, you don't have? Oh, okay, maybe Maria, you sit with Fatty over there. He's got a copy on his computer. Not that it's easy to... Having the text is obviously one thing. Sorry. Having the text is one thing. Reading it is obviously another thing. So anyone who's read this, what is Fulcher saying here? Okay, Jaren?
He mentions that it's the will of Christ. Christ commands it. And it says also on this account, I or rather the Lord, which we see that as the Pope, I am the representative of Christ on earth, and he tells me to tell you this, that this is his wish and his commanding the Crusades. And also there's the point I mentioned in my presentation as well, that you've been fighting with your own brothers, but this time, instead of having silver or wine or something, you
Yes, in Fulcher we definitely see this desire to redirect violence by Christian men in the correct way, in this case against Muslims rather than against each other. That's one of the things which is the kind of big preface to this point. So you're fighting, why don't you actually fight the real enemy instead of fighting amongst each other? Which may be then a context of the papacy trying to control secular society or use secular society for its own ends. We have to think about that. But okay, Elif?
Now I remember, because I was going to ask the question last class, that it also occurred to me that it's as if getting rid of all those people and then building up the church authority, because also knights involved in this crusade and people, noble people also involved in the crusade, and then there was a lack of authority maybe in the land, if I'm right. This is my understanding.
So you're feeling that the violence is undermining the church's authority or the Pope's authority.
Yeah.
So if we tell them to go over there, then we can control things. Yeah, that's another possibility, I suppose. We can impose the reforms and plans of Gregory and others more effectively if we don't have this resistance from society in a way. So a rather more pragmatic, practical reason to control the violence. So that's another option. But definitely here Fulcher is stressing, go and fight the real enemy, not each other. That seems to be the main point that he's stressing. What in this account is the aim of this proclamation? What are they supposed to be doing once they set off? Where are they going, or what are they trying to do, according to Fulcher here? Comes a bit later, towards the bottom of the text. Anyone? Serkan?
That to save Christendom from barbarians?
Specifically which bit of Christendom? So yeah, Romania, or in my Romania, it doesn't mean kind of the modern state of Romania, of course. It means the land of the Romans, Byzantium, I suppose, in that sense, or Greek Empire, as is added in. So Jerusalem is not mentioned at all here, and obviously the Byzantines, who have asked for help previously, probably not thinking much about Jerusalem either, perhaps, because that's well gone. They're concerned with the effects of Seljuk expansion, the Battle of Manzikert, and all the things that they've lost over the past 20 years or so, and things like that. But here, absolutely no mention of Jerusalem. Okay? And Fulcher is one of the big sources for this. And he puts his context, as Jeren said, in the redirection of Christian violence in the right kind of a way. Okay, I've got it. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Okay, in that sense is the point. In addition, here it mentions the immediate remission of sins. This thing we discussed: if you go away, your sins will be cleansed, and so on. Your soul will be saved. The things that I think it was Morat was saying then. Okay. All right. That's one. Next one on my version, which I guess is the same, but printed previously, number 2, Robert the Monk, writing round about circa 1120, I think, somewhere round about there. Okay, what is he stressing here?
I think it was the text that he in detail tells about the torture.
The terrible things that the Turks have been doing, basically. Yes, we won't go into all the gruesome, gory details, but to make people feel inspired, he's really kind of going into the sort of the X-rated kind of account and so on of all the things they've been doing physically to these lovely Christians and things like that.
This race from the kingdom of Persian and a cursed race, the race utterly alienated from the... Are these the text?
Yes. they didn't have quite the modern ethnicity and linguistic understanding. So the Turks are some kind of Easterners or whatever that came through Iranian lands. So yeah, you are a race of Persians in that kind of a sense for them. Fatih, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, Jerusalem was mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. So.
It's described as like heavenly territories for Christians, and you mentioned about Muslims do not deserve to live there since they're barbaric for him, barbaric habits and tortures against Christians.
Yeah, okay, so you've got the holy city and then you've got these barbaric, terrible, inhuman people. Put the two together and a medieval mind will feel inspired to go on the crusade. So we've got Jerusalem mentioned here. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Holy Sepulchre, anyone? Yeah, it's the meant to be where he's supposedly, yeah, and so on. But where he was buried and things like that. Okay, so we've got Fulcher and Robert with slightly different emphases and slightly different points. Move on quickly then. Number 3, Gesta Francorum. Though it says here the writer may have been connected to the Bohemond of Antioch, one of the Normans that Murat was telling us about him on Friday. This is the shortest one, but the earliest one that the others expand on. What do we get from this? Anything particular? It's the oldest one in theory. It's kind of going to tell us some things. What do we get from this? Anything? I haven't got much from it, to be honest with you myself, so I'm hoping you've got some ideas.
That one is had the most religious emphasis on itself, since just talking about the purity of the belief, about going after Jesus and other stuff, not mentioning Jerusalem or other side reasons of moving against the Muslims just because of the going after the Jesus himself. The most emphasis to Christendom and the purity of the belief.
Right. Okay. Good. And what about the aim? What's the aim here? Jerusalem, we've got Holy Sepulchre mentioned here, haven't we? Take up the way to the Holy Sepulchre. So Jerusalem perhaps part of the plan here. Alp, you're frowning.
At the top, before the active text, it says anonymous, by an anonymous writer that are connected to someone of Antioch.
Bohemond. One of the Normans that was on the Crusade.
So I'm just wondering whether there's kind of local influence now. Someone from Antioch,
well, it means, yeah, they're suggesting it, well, presumably if we had the whole of the original of this with us, there's going to be lots of mentions of the Normans and Bohemond and things. So they don't, it doesn't say, you know, I'm with my friend Bohemond, the Norman or whatever, but there's enough references and the things that seem to be given a lot of detail suggest a connection with that group and with Bohemond himself. So Antioch there doesn't mean this guy comes from Antioch, but he's associated with that camp. And when he was writing his account very early after the Crusade, he was probably on the Crusade, but he was in that group in that sense. Okay, number 3, no, I've got 2 3s here. Number 4 it should be, Baldric of Dol, writing, again, early on, maybe finishing towards 10 years or so after. What do we get from this one then? What are the emphases? What are the ideas here? Jerusalem is definitely mentioned here, okay. What's the problem that they're discussing? What is the way of inspiring people to go to Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem is definitely the focus of this one.
The Turks have their guys under their sword. Turks have Christians under their sword.
Right. And
So he creates a dichotomy in the Greek, whereas some of the other texts are more into individual salvation, taking the journey for individual salvation and all that. But this one is about, two people's sort of, one is under the other, and we have to save our brother.
yeah, it's the Turks are bad in this one, but it's not because they're kind of barbarians doing horrible things to people. It's that they're not Christians, and so Christianity has been damaged by their presence in that sense, I suppose. So yes, that's fair enough. So again, something to inspire, something to get people to go along, and Jerusalem definitely figuring in that one. And we even have here, I've underlined it myself, I notice, okay, concern with violence, but Knights of Christ, okay, is the phrase that comes out here. So again, redirecting your violence, your but knightly behaviour for Christ, the concept of a holy war mentioned there. Guibert, what do we get from him? Anything from this one? Does he mention Jerusalem for a start? Yeah, Jerusalem is here. Okay.
There are much more references to Jews in general, not just Jerusalem.
Right.
The Maccabees, those people who, stood against the Romans and everything. Yeah, so he's sort of, metaphorically.
Yes, because Christians are always using the Old Testament metaphorically to support their own ideas, so they are the modern Jews in that sense. But so using that kind of imagery as well, references to the Bible and so on. But Jerusalem is big, and in general, kind of the Holy Land, the land of the Jews and so on there. So less concern with the Greeks in Anatolia, clearly, okay, a different emphasis in that way, okay. And lastly, do you also have this thing from the end of the year, Urban's letter of instruction, little short thing at the bottom there. Once things are about to get going, okay, we get this kind of good luck kind of message from the Pope in a way. Here we have the holy city of Christ, Jerusalem, of course, talks about the Orient, the East, to free the churches of the East, I can see there as well. And here we have Adhemar as the sort of papal leader mentioned specifically as well, which Murat was telling us about. That's one of the groups that went, and this is the attempt by the Pope to make sure that the papacy, through its representative, is kind of controlling things as well. So what do you think from that brief survey? What was Pope Urban planning? What was his intention, if anything? Was Jerusalem part of the deal, or has it been added in later on because they got there and got it, following their successes in Anatolia and Antioch and so on, or was Jerusalem always planned by Urban as being the aim, do you think? Ravel?
It might be stretching it a bit far, but it seems like it could have just been said as like a rhetorical thing, like the Muslims have taken like Jerusalem, they've moved through the Holy Lands, and now they're continuing in their pilgrimage over like our Christian brothers in like the Greek kingdom. So like maybe like his desire was to just like reclaim Greek lands and like kind of support the Greek Empire. But I mean, realistically, like the kind of rhetoric that talks about Jerusalem having been overtaken, the atrocities that occurred in Jerusalem and in the former Holy Lands, it certainly helps his case. For
right. That has been argued, that Jerusalem is kind of, again, another way of inspiring the would-be crusaders to get involved. rather than that it was something that the Pope realistically thought they could get, but that if you know, Jerusalem was somehow put into the mix, it would get them excited. So Pope Urban may have mentioned Jerusalem, but it wasn't really his kind of real intention. Now that's more difficult to establish. So first question is, did he mention Jerusalem? And then if he did, we have these various interpretations of what he meant. Okay, Alp and then Fatih.
Yeah, could it be the case that merely helping out the Christian brothers in Byzantium, not necessarily actually motivate people to get people to
yeah,
go
that's what we're saying. I mean, if it's just helping them Greeks, then plenty of guys would say, well, you know, can't they look after themselves? Okay, they're Christians, but you know, they're actually wealthier than we are, or something like that. Whereas if you throw into Jerusalem, where Christ died on the cross and was buried and then rose, whatever, and so on, then obviously that's the very core of Christianity, and so it will inspire them more to get involved. Okay, ladies first, gentlemen there. Yeah.
Did he have the reunification of Roman Catholic Church and Orthodox Church?
Well, of course, there had been attempts to heal the schism, the rift, a little bit during this time. I can't remember if either Jeren or Murat were mentioning this. And excommunications of Byzantine emperor and so on had been dropped. So there was an attempt to kind of be on friendlier terms. Whether reunification of the two churches was considered, I don't know. That may have been a little bit too advanced at this point, because the two groups still had their own kind of sphere of influence, and the papacy was, over the past few decades, had been reasserting itself, as we've been discussing in the past few weeks as well. So I'm not sure about that.
And sent, I think, his representative to Piacenza some months before Clermont, right? Openly asking for the help.
That's right, yes. Now I've got various things now. Okay. We have yes, I've got various things to remind myself. Earlier, Pope Gregory, as we may have mentioned recently, Pope Gregory VII had himself kind of thought about the idea of some crusade, because there had been an initial request for help from Byzantium back in the time of his papacy. And we have this document, which I've got here, 1074, where he talks about a pagan race taking over almost up to the walls of Constantinople, it says. Talks about the misfortune of the Greek Empire, and that we need to render help to this Christian empire, and so on. No mention there of Jerusalem, as far as I can see, in Gregory's original plan that didn't actually follow through. There are lots and lots of other documents from around this time that accounts of Pope Urban turning up at particular monasteries and places, and records there which fit into what we're doing. We can't go into it all now. But we do have a version of, again, it's probably a bit later, but the actual Council of Clermont, a record of the main decisions made at the council. And the second one, set out very, very simply, says, if any man sets forth to liberate the Church of God at Jerusalem, out of devotion alone and not for love of glory or of gain, the journey shall be accounted a complete penance on his part. So again, the sins issue and so on. So this version, which may or may not be kind of actual drawn up at the council, but may have been a slightly later version still, but does refer to Jerusalem as well. From what I understood, Jerusalem possibly was mentioned by Pope Urban. Well, that's what people seem to think more these days. The question of whether he actually thought they would get there and liberate it, or whether, as we were saying in the discussion, it was a way of inspiring people more than just helping those Greeks or whatever, is perhaps harder to prove, and things like that. But Jerusalem does become more and more important in these accounts. At least that's partly because they did get Jerusalem. So when you end up writing an account of the Crusade, it's like when I tell you to write a good essay, always write your introduction and your conclusion last when you've written the bulk of it. So when the bulk of the Crusade has happened, then they say, okay, what's the introduction? Well, let's write about Urban, so we mention Jerusalem or whatever. So whereas that's putting it a little bit kind of simplistically, there may have been a bit of that going on as well. But I think possibly Jerusalem was mentioned in some form, but whether it's because he wanted them to liberate it, or whether it was just this idea that we've come up with that it was another more effective way of inspiring noblemen in France and elsewhere to get involved is harder to prove. Okay, let's stop there with that because time is moving on. I want to make a little start with our next topic, which is society in the Central and later Middle Ages. For Friday, I want you all to have a go at reading Chaucer's, the prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's the first part of that. This week and next week we shall sit down and read some of that and think about it both as literature and what it tells us as historians as well. I've posted on Moodle a very short kind of guide to late Middle English grammar. I mean, to a large extent, Chaucer is relatively easy. Now, you might disagree with me on that one, but once you know a few things, once you've got some points and understood a few little idiosyncrasies, it actually begins to fall into place. Now, for myself or Ravel as native English speakers, obviously it's going to be a bit easier than for those of you who've learned English more recently, but still I think after a certain point it kind of flows along. So, and there is obviously plenty of translations around, so I'm not saying you can't refer to translations to help you as well. Okay, as a preface to Friday then, when we will also have, now who's presenting on Friday? We think we've got the one, yeah, okay, Eileen, one presentation then as well. Let me start off with a few very, very general words about kind of medieval society in general. Some of the things that we've actually, to some extent, already thought about ourselves. Now, it's very often stated in kind of textbooks and internet sites or wherever that medieval society constituted three groups or orders, and a number of sort of very often quoted but small number of sources describe these three orders as, in one version, oratores, bellatores, laboratores. Latinists, any guesses as to what one or any of these words might mean? Laboratores is definitely the workers, the ones doing the work, the labour there. Bellum, have you learnt bellum, the word bellum? Fighting, war, okay. An orator, of course, is someone speaking, but here it means praying, okay. Preaching, well, yes, kind of, preachers or whatever. So usually these are translated as those who pray, those who fight, and those who do the work, right? And obviously, these are a relative minority, and these represent the bulk of the society. The first one clearly refers to formal members of the church, the clergy, whether they are bishops, part of the formal hierarchy all the way up to the Pope, whether they are abbots and monks and various other rather more specialist groups, and we've discussed these over time. Bellatores doesn't just mean warriors. In fact, really it refers here to nobility. It refers to the noblemen. So we could say kind of church, nobles slash knights, all right, in a sense, and we would include kings in there because they are, although they are, as we were discussing recently, a different group because of being formally ordained by a member of the church and so on, but they are usually part of the noble group in one way or another. That's where they come from, as we've seen more than once when we have a change of dynasty or whatever. And the workers there, to a large extent, means the rural workers, the peasants, who are living and working on the land, but we could include that small group of people who are living in urban spaces, in towns, which are expanding during the Central and later Middle Ages. This is one way of looking at it, and it's a way that's often referred to, and in a sense it's the origin of the estates of later French history. If you look at your French Revolution, you know about the 3 estates and so on, things like that. Now, that model fits in there. Obviously, the medieval people were not professional sociologists or something. They didn't go around analysing their own society very much. They had other things of a religious or violent nature, or for most people, getting enough money or enough food and so on to keep alive. So they had other things to do. So we don't have, this is just one image which is partly a medieval picture. I like to think of medieval society as a kind of mixture of various dichotomies. A dichotomy is what? What does that mean? We're doing it in sign language now. What? Someone's. Yeah, contrasts or oppositions which somehow connect up in one way or another, and opposing points. So this is even simplifying it from a 3-point tripartite division. I'm going to suggest various ways of looking at medieval society, which are not all exclusive to one another, which are more dichotomous. So, for example, for a long time, we can talk about people who are free and those who are unfree. Okay, during the Central later Middle Ages, sort of slavedom disappears. You don't get people who are slaves in the earlier sense of the word, but serfs were relatively unfree in many parts of Western Europe. That's one way of looking at it. Another way, because the church hierarchically, intellectually, culturally very important, is to look at the contrast between the laity on the one hand and members of the church on the other. Okay, they're another, I say not necessarily in opposition, but separate points, different points there. We talked about the word paganus many weeks ago. Pagan now in English means non-religious, non-Christian or whatever. Originally it refers to whom? Countryside dwellers, country people or something like that. So, and obviously we talk about urban, urbanus there. So the contrast between the town and the country, which is becoming more and more important. Post Roman Western Europe, towns significantly in decline, but by the 12th century and later we see commercial and urban revival, and so we will talk next week about what's going on in towns as well. Alp?
I have a guess. Latin versus vernacular, perhaps? Latin language versus vernacular language. Latin versus vernacular cultures.
Okay, I mean, my list is not exhaustive. I hadn't thought of that one. So you're proposing another one? Okay, yes. Some part. I mean, okay, yes. Latin was and remained throughout the Middle Ages, to a large extent, the main language of communication, formal written communication, and was spoken in various quarters as well. In some places, including, for example, Anglo-Saxon England, they did promote quite early on the use of their own language for both government but also in literature. So we have quite a large body of Old English literature which survives from the later part, especially of the Anglo-Saxon period, whereas for something like French and other vernacular languages, it's a bit later before we get a more substantial corpus and communication in those languages. Then after 1066, of course, when the Normans come, English, the status of English went down. Nobility and kings were using French, again another vernacular language, and English gradually reasserts itself. So yeah, that's quite an interesting, we can put this one here, add this one to that one, and I'll write that down later and steal it from you for 2 years later when I teach the course again. That's quite a good one. I mean, a simpler one I was thinking again is just in terms of socio-economic situation. Unlike today in many parts of Europe, when society is to a large extent more balanced, though we still have very wealthy people and poorer people, in Turkey the contrast is more marked than, for example, in Britain. But in the Middle Ages, a very strong marked difference between those who were wealthy and very wealthy and those who were poor and often very, very poor as well. So socioeconomic ability. I'm not leaving gender right to the end for any particular reason, but obviously the situation of men and women was rather different in medieval society to a large extent. In many parts of the world it still is, but hopefully that difference is getting less and less. You can, and many people do, write the history of women in the Middle Ages, but it's rather more difficult because they don't figure in so many sources until a little bit later on, apart from notable queens and so on, things like that. So here is, from me and also the contribution from Alp, a series of possible dichotomies of kind of opposing or different points that we can use to look at medieval society. And they're not all exclusive. They can overlap in some way. You can have very wealthy members of the church, but you also had very poor members of the church. Okay. Similarly, okay, you had people like the Cistercians we mentioned trying to get away from lay society, and so they were living in obscure parts of the countryside. Whereas on the other hand, you had people like the mendicants, the friars, who wanted to interact with people and help people, ordinary people. So they were, for example, setting themselves up in towns. So again, a contrast there, different groups of clergy behaving differently and so on. So this is another paradigm, another way of approaching this issue. I don't say it's a perfect one, it's just another approach to this matter. So what we're going to look at on Friday is primarily a few aspects of rural countryside society, which will include some of these dichotomies. I expect an Eileen will be talking especially about rural society. I will, if we have time, I will say a little bit about the nobility and maybe a little bit about chivalry as well. You probably did get noblemen and knights in medieval towns, but to a large extent we associate them with the rural side of things as well. So I'll say a little bit more about feudalism and so on. But the general prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, though it's a piece of literature, so we can't quote it as necessarily perfect historical evidence in that sense, because Chaucer has a number of things he's trying to achieve there. But for those of you who's read Chaucer as literature students or in other ways, who's familiar with Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or whatever? Okay, a few of you there, a couple of you there. But he basically, okay, the idea is, it's one of these, like the 1001 Nights or Dede Korkut or something. It's a collection of stories, and he provides this frame to put all the different stories together. So he says a number of people, myself included, are going to go on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and Alp will tell us a bit about that on Friday this week. And while they're setting off on this journey, this kind of hajj, this pilgrimage, their host, as he's called, says, this is a bit boring, isn't it? They're all going along like this or whatever. Why don't we all take it in turns to tell a story? And someone, oh, that's fair enough. And I'll give a prize to the winner. I'll be the one to decide which is the best story. And then from then onwards, Chaucer has all these different stories. Some of them English tradition, some of them he's copying from Italy and so on. They're all going from classical tradition or whatever. But it's good, an example of a kind of collection of medieval stories and things like that. Before he does that, he tells us a little bit about the different people who were on the pilgrimage. So he goes through saying there was a knight, there was a nun, there was a priest, there was a guy, guildsmen from the town and so on. And he gives a little picture, sometimes satirical, sometimes making a little bit of criticism of the characters, not individually, but of that group of people in the society. So it's quite good fun to read. If we understand it, we try and work out what he's trying to do there in that sense. So we'll start with the beginning of it, and we'll pick a few of the characters, and then we'll carry on next week doing that as well. Have a read, see what you can do, but we'll take it slowly in class as well. Okay, thank you very much. See you all on Friday.